Relations Department at the IMF, and I hope that by this time all of you have had access to the document that we just published about an hour ago. If you don't have access yet, I would recommend you to go to imf.org and you can download the latest edition. And I also want to put in context the regional economic outlook. Basically, it builds on top of the World Economic Outlook that we presented in Washington in October 11th. And basically, it focused more on the regional outlook, the risks, and also the policy recommendations. And in this latest edition, it's important to underscore that we will find a much more in-depth analysis on how to improve the productivity in the region, also the impact that the tightening from the Fed is having in Latin America, but also what's the impact of inflation surging in the last couple of months and in the last year. And to answer all these questions and to talk about it, we have with us Nigel. He is the acting director of the Western Hemisphere Department at the IMF. Also here with us are Ana Corbacho, she's assistant director and the mission chief for Chile, and Gustavo Adler. He is division chief for the regional economic studies at the Western Hemisphere Department at the IMF. Nigel is going to start with some short opening remarks, and then we will proceed to take your questions. I want to remind everyone that we have a simultaneous interpretation into English, Spanish, and Portuguese. With that said, Nigel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jose Luis, and thank you for joining us today. So, over the last 3 years, we've seen the Western Hemisphere region subject to two distinct shocks. First of all, the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As a result, the region contracted very sharply in 2020, but then bounced back pretty strongly in 2021 and 2022. They were helped by the global recovery, a normalization of service sectors as the COVID pandemic waned, and booming commodity prices. Amid this strong demand rebound from COVID, pandemic-related disruptions, high commodity prices, and inflationary pressures in general emerged in 2021. Russia's war in Ukraine has exacerbated these inflationary problems. Monetary authorities in the region responded very quickly. They moved well ahead of others in the world to contain price pressures. I think in part noting the history of inflation in the region. Nonetheless, inflation is still high in virtually every country across the Western Hemisphere region. And now the global environment is again shifting. A third global shock faces the region as systemic economies raise their policy rates and global financial conditions tighten. This in turn is leading the engines of growth for the world economy to slow. We see that in China, in Europe, in the US, and it's leading commodity prices to soften. And it's these forces that will shape the prospects for the region in the coming year. We expect growth to decelerate throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, going from 3.5% this year to 1.7% next year. And downside risks dominate the outlook. Financial conditions could be even tighter than they are today. Inflation may prove more persistent and require an even more forceful response by central banks in the region. And commodity prices may fall faster than we're currently expecting. This will help some in the region, it will hurt others in the region. And finally, elevated inequality and greater food insecurity with high energy and food prices create a potential for social unrest that hovers over the outlook. Here are the main messages from our regional outlook. The region is going to face a more challenging 2023. Growth will slow, and things could be worse than they currently are. We see a 1 in 5 chance that the systemic Latin American economies as a group will contract next year. Secondly, restoring price stability has to be a priority. Monetary policy needs to stay the course and not ease prematurely. Both fiscal and monetary policies need to pull in the same direction to bring down inflation. This effort, unfortunately, will exert economic costs on the population in the near term, but it is essential to ease the cost of living crisis. And we know the poor who are most negatively affected by inflation. And it will create the conditions for sustained growth and job creation going forward. We know the history of the region of the costs of having to restore price stability when inflation becomes entrenched are very high, and we need to avoid repeating that. Thirdly, social equity has to be a central focus for policymakers. The harmful impact on vulnerable populations from high in food energy prices and slowing growth is a recipe for social discontent and cannot be ignored. This must be built into policy choices. Fourth, most countries in the region also need to strengthen their public finances. They need to reduce debt and rebuild policy space so that they can respond in the event of future shocks. However, this has to be done inclusively, so a consolidation that protects social objectives. And finally, there's a lot to do on supply-side policies. Boosting growth requires strengthening human capital, particularly after the education losses we saw through COVID, modernizing tax rules, revamping labor regulations, lifting barriers from entrepreneurs who wish to form new businesses. A lot of these reforms are at the micro level. The region also has work to do to reap the benefits and also to minimize the costs of the reconstellation of the global system as it moves to a more digital, a more green and less carbon-intensive future, and possibly a more fragmented global economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nigel. So all the reporters that are here in the room and want to ask a question, please raise your hand and identify yourself. And I also want to remind that we received a lot of questions online from different media in the region, including Bloomberg Linea, Deutsche Welle Español, EFE, and also Forbes Colombia. So we will be formulating those questions on the reporters' behalf. Let's start here in the room. Is there anyone that wants to ask a question? Go ahead.
Can we ask in Spanish?
Yeah, you can ask in Spanish, actually, and we wait to get the microphone.
Hola, buenos días. Soy Belén Vázquez de CNN Chile. Quería preguntarles, en la exposición en la que estábamos hace un par de minutitos, el expresidente del Banco Central, Vittorio Corvo, señalaba que en nuestro país, en 2021, dado todos los estímulos fiscales y también todos los retiros de fondos de pensiones, reventó la economía. Justamente hoy conocimos cifras de crecimiento de actividad mensual que han mostrado que la economía ha tenido más resiliencia quizá de la que esperaba el mercado. Entonces, ahí quería preguntarles cuál es el análisis que se hace respecto a la recuperación que podríamos tener después de este, como lo llamó el expresidente, reventón de la economía. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias.
Perdón si fui muy rápido.
Muchísimas gracias. Ana, ¿quieres responder esta pregunta?
Con mucho gusto, gracias por la pregunta. Ciertamente en algo que se destacó Chile fue en su recuperación muy fuerte, muy rápida del impacto que tuvo la pandemia en la economía. Y esto claramente es algo que es positivo, pero al mismo tiempo llevó a la acumulación de desequilibrios macroeconómicos, presiones inflacionarias muy fuertes, un dinamismo del consumo y de las importaciones que elevaron el déficit de cuenta corriente y también el uso del espacio fiscal que Chile había acumulado en episodios anteriores, por ejemplo, cuando los precios de los commodities estuvieron muy elevados. Esto hace que ahora sea prioritario acompañar a la economía hacia un proceso de desaceleración. Ese proceso lo consideramos necesario, importante. Va a ser costoso, pero al mismo tiempo es lo que permitirá que Chile desarme esos desequilibrios y vuelva a una agenda de crecimiento que sea sostenible. Entonces, muy positiva la recuperación, fue un estímulo que fue efectivo, que fue bien coordinado, pero al mismo tiempo que llevó a excesos que ahora se están desarmando. Y por tanto vemos muy acertado el giro de política macroeconómica, tanto en la parte monetaria como en la parte fiscal, que están acompañando a la economía a ese proceso de ajuste. Hacia el año próximo lo que vemos es un crecimiento que va a ser negativo y eso es lo que permitirá que la economía un poquito más adelante vuelva a esa senda sostenible que es tan importante. Gracias.
Gracias, Ana. Any other questions here in the room? Okay, so I'm gonna start asking some of the questions that we received online. Nigel, I think this is for you, and it's more of a regional perspective. What is the most concerning issue for the region's outlook? Is there a risk of recession? And if not for the region as a whole, at least for the largest, biggest economies in Latin America?
Thank you. So I'm going to take a liberty and give two things we worry about. So I think the first thing we worry about is if inflation in the region is more pronounced and more sticky and persistent than we currently expect. This would provide an important downside risk because central banks will have to move more forcefully to re-anchor the system at lower levels of inflation and bring inflation back to their inflation targets. And naturally, that's going to have costs on the economy in terms of higher unemployment, slower growth, more restrained demand. And then the second risk is really a global risk, is we know the Fed's been tightening very fast. The dollar is very strong. Global financial conditions have tightened. When we look at previous episodes where we've seen such tightening of global financial conditions, such a tightening cycle in the United States, there tends to be more vulnerabilities revealed, more risks in countries that have overborrowed, particularly overborrowed in dollars. And so this tightening of global financial conditions, I think, is an important risk, both to the region and to the global economy. And conditions have already tightened quite a lot, but we could see them tightening further, particularly if inflation in the systemic advanced economies remains persistent and the central banks have to do more. In terms of the risk of a recession, it's certainly an important risk that the region has to be conscious of. As Anna had said, Chile is expected to contract next year. We currently expect that around a 20% probability that the region's large systemic emerging economies will contract next year. But if financial conditions tighten further, if commodity prices fall by more, if central banks have to move by more, then that probability will go up quite a lot. So we are concerned about the risk of recession, but it's not our baseline case.
Thank you, Nigel. We have a question, or some country-specific questions, and I'm going to start with Peru. This question comes from Rumber Linea. Peru has been the scene of much political movement this past year, and it's perceived to be affecting the economy more now than before. What is your outlook for the Andean country? This question maybe is for Gustavo.
Thank you, Jose. Indeed, we have seen some uncertainty in politics in Peru, and this uncertainty can, of course, spill into the uncertainty about policy, economic policy, and eventually can affect the investors' confidence and decisions on investment and the economy. But it's also important to recognize that Peru's fundamentals are quite solid in many dimensions, and there is a history of very prudent macro management. I mean, if we look at public debt levels in Peru are very low, reserve buffers are ample, and the framework, the institutional framework for policy making in terms of the inflation targeting regime as well as the fiscal rule are very solid. The financial system is very solid as well. So with that in mind, we see the economy quite resilient, and we are projecting that this year is going to grow by about 2.7% after a very high growth in 2021. And for next year, we are expecting growth at around 2.6%. Thank you.
Thank you. We have multiple questions on Brazil. I'm going to try to group them. One of them goes, Brazil has been one of the emerging countries apparently less vulnerable to interest rate hikes in the US. The exchange rate has not depreciated as much, and risky assets have not lost as much value. Do you agree with this perception? If yes, what are the reasons? And then we have multiple questions regarding the outcome of the presidential elections. What are the immediate challenges that the next government will have to tackle in early 2023, and for what reasons?
So in terms of Brazil's vulnerability to rising interest rates in the US and broadly the tightening, as I mentioned, the tightening of financial conditions globally, yes, Brazil's done quite well. Their exchange rate has held up extremely well. I think we've seen that in a couple of countries in Latin America also. It's not solely linked to Brazil. Obviously, their financing costs have gone up with global financing costs, but the pressures on the domestic system have been much less. I think I'd point to two reasons why that's the case. First of all, the policy frameworks in Brazil are strong. The inflation targeting of the central bank is well tested. It's got a long history. It's a strong framework. The fiscal framework also is while debt's relatively high, the fiscal framework gives some confidence that there's processes in place to bring debt down. So the policy frameworks being allowed to work has been an important thing. And then, as I mentioned before, the central banks in this region, and particularly in Brazil, moved very fast, very quickly to contain inflationary pressures. There was no discussion in Latin America about whether inflation was transitory or not. When the inflation was seen, the central banks acted. So interest rates, domestic interest rates in reais in Brazil have been going up quite fast, and that's provided significant support to the exchange rate. In terms of the challenges going forward from Brazil, I think the challenges are the same, basically, regardless of what the political constellation is. I think the first challenge is bringing inflation back down. Unfortunately, in Brazil, we're starting to see a turn in the inflation statistics and data. It looks like it's starting to soften, but we can't take that for granted. We still have to be persistent on the monetary policy to bring inflation down. I think, secondly, rebuilding fiscal space, bringing down the public debt to GDP ratio, and doing it in a way that's sensitive to social equity concerns and ensuring that both the vulnerable and the middle class are treated fairly in terms of that adjustment. And then finally, I think, just looking over a longer horizon, there's a lot to do on the supply side in Brazil. It's still a relatively closed economy. Having more trade liberalization would help. Rethinking the tax system to have a more efficient tax system, addressing informality, which is also linked to the tax question, and improving productivity. These are all really important goals for the country going forward.
Thank you, Nigel. We have a question on Colombia from Sebastián Montes from Forbes Colombia, and it goes as follows. In cases such as Colombia, environmental protection would imply important reductions in the activity of industries such as hydrocarbons. But the concern is that this industry provides the largest amount of income in dollars to the country. Can positions such as these have a direct impact on the country's economic growth? I think this goes for you, Gustavo.
Thank you, Jose. Yeah, indeed, income from hydrocarbon industry is key in Colombia, both for fiscal and external sustainability. And of course, we welcome initiatives that move in the direction of making the economy greener and moving toward greener energies in general. But it's important that these are done in a gradual manner, in a way that is consistent with macroeconomic stability, and also in a credible way that allows agents to plan accordingly and make their investment decisions according to these plans.
Okay, we're going to continue. We have a question on Chile. Anna, how can we explain that Chile is the only country in Latin America whose economy will fall by 2023? And what are the main economic challenges for this country in the coming years? This question comes from Bloomberg Linea.
Thank you. The reason why we are projecting a deceleration and, in fact, negative growth for Chile next year is that Chile is coming from an extremely strong cyclical position. During the pandemic, Chile deployed very large macroeconomic stimulus of using different instruments on the fiscal side, monetary side, credit measures, as well as very large pension withdrawals. This contributed to a very fast recovery, but also to the buildup of a positive output gap, inflationary pressures, and an elevated current account deficit. This is now requiring the adjustment of macroeconomic policies, a restrictive monetary and fiscal stance, and this will lead into a contraction of the economy next year, which will help then sustain the recovery over the medium term and the stability of both price and growth. In terms of the key challenges, of course, is this managing this transition, this necessary transition towards more sustainable growth is key, containing inflationary pressures and securing the achievement of the inflation target in the policy horizon, so between now and 2 years ahead, and advancing also with the protection of vulnerable groups who have been affected by very high inflation in food and energy in particular, as well as a recovery in the labor market that has not been as strong as in the widespread economic activity. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I'm going to go back to the floor. This is your chance if you want to ask a question. No questions from the floor? Okay, so we will continue with those who came online. Ana Nieto from Deutsche Welle Español wants to know, so far the region has been somehow resilient to the Fed hiking rates. Can the situation change and be more uncomfortable for Latin America and the Caribbean? And she has also a second question. Besides Mexico, which other countries will be impacted by the slowdown or even potential recession in the US in 2023?
Okay. So yes, the region has been resilient to the Fed increases. There's two remarks I'd make about that. Is that the tightening of US monetary policy is still relatively new. In the past, when we've seen strains build in economies as a spillover effect from US monetary policy, it doesn't happen immediately. It takes some time. And so, yes, it's good that the region's held up well, but we should also not be complacent that this will continue, that we may see more vulnerabilities revealed as buffers are eroded, as countries and companies need to increase their financing and go back to capital markets for financing and find that capital markets perhaps aren't open. So, so far so good, but still a great deal of care is needed going forward, and the situation can change. Secondly, is that what's priced in now for Fed rate increases we think is appropriate and will bring inflation back to its target. But this is an unprecedented episode. We don't know how persistent and sticky US inflation will be. And we're confident that if inflation is more persistent in the US, then the Fed will move by more, which will mean the interest rates, global interest rates will rise further and the dollar will strengthen more. And that will be painful for the region. In terms of the spillover implications from the US, so I think the financial channels of spillover are pretty pervasive across the region. We know that a lot of the region relies on US dollar financing, and so we see an immediately channel effect to most of the region through the financial channels. The real channels are less important for the region in the sense that the US trade is more tilted towards Canada, Mexico, and the Asia supply chain, so they're less reliant on the region. However, the region has benefited a great deal in the past few years from a big increase in exports, in part to some of those going to the US. As the US slows, and particularly what's happening in the US now is a shift from goods consumption to services consumption. And so their demand for goods is going to be much less going forward. In fact, it's contracting right now, which is not is going to have negative spillovers for the region as both their economy slows and then they buy less of the products that this region produces. Certainly, all of our analysis shows that Mexico and Canada are the biggest affected by the most, but the rest of the region is not immune to a slowdown in the US.
Thank you, Nigel. I'm going to go for just last two questions. One is country specific, and it relates to Argentina. Francisco Aldaya from Bloomberg Linea wants to know, almost all private economists in Argentina agree that 2023 will bring similar annual inflation levels compared to 2022, but the fund is projecting 60% in line with Massa's 2023 budget. How does the IMF explain this to be a realistic goal?
So on Argentina, as you know, we've just completed a review of the IMF program with Argentina in just a couple of weeks ago, and that program review lays out a framework for stabilizing the economy in Argentina and bringing down inflation. We believe that framework will be effective, so this is not happening in the absence of policy. The policy based on the budget passed in Argentina, plus a continued tightening of monetary policy, we think will be sufficient to bring inflation down. And going into next year, we expect the year to end of inflation around 60%.
Okay, and we go with the last question. This has a more regional tone. How can the region increase employment creation and allow for an overdue increases in real wages under the current global inflationary pressures and weak external demand?
Thanks. So as I mentioned, a lot of the challenges facing the region are really micro challenges right now. So in terms of improving employment, raising productivity growth and raising long-term growth in the region. A lot of it is dependent on things like labor market reforms, tax reforms, which we're seeing being proposed in Chile and Colombia and elsewhere in the region are considering tax reforms. Thinking about competition policy across the region, thinking about how best to catch up from the education losses that we saw during the pandemic and improving human capital through investments in education. To some extent, improving infrastructure in the region is an important goal. All of these things, I think, will end up boosting demand, boosting the economy, allowing for more job creation, more employment. I think there's also a very important issue related to labor force participation, particularly for females in the region. So finding ways to support females through the tax system, through supporting childcare costs, and increasing labor force participation, I think would also help increase employment. And ultimately, this will raise living standards, raise productivity, and as productivity goes up, we know that real wages rise and people are better off. Thanks.
Thank you, Nigel, and I want to thank everyone, those who attended the Banco Central de Chile, those who joining us online. I also want to thank the Banco Central de Chile for being such an exceptional host. Also thank Ana, Nigel, and Gustavo for their time. And if you have any additional question, please don't hesitate to send it to media@imf.org. Have a good rest of your day, and if you have a chance, joining us in the next panel. Thank you very much.